And the Torah portion this week is Lekh Lekha. And it begins in Bereshit 12. And it's a long Torah portion, guys. There's no way we can really even scratch the surface of it. But what I plan to do is maybe do a little bit of a survey. And by survey, I mean try to hit some high points up to a certain point in the Torah portion, and then maybe I can fill in some things tomorrow with tomorrow's class, especially as it pertains to Abraham and the wars with the kings and so forth. But in the overview, I think what we have here is a great example of details that you don't catch unless you read the text in Hebrew. And when you read the text in Hebrew, what will stand out to you is maybe things that appear to be misspelled. And of course, it can't be misspelled because it's the biblical text. So all we can really say is there's an anomaly in the spelling, or there's an anomaly in the usage. So we're not saying that the grammar or the spelling is wrong. What we're saying is because it's different than what we expected, then we have to investigate. We have to try to figure out what's going on. And obviously the best sources for that are people who have studied the Hebrew text for millennia. And so that's why sources like Rashi or Onkelos, who translated it into Aramaic, that gives us a little bit extra insight as to the, what's the name of there's a book out there called What's Bothering Rashi? And he goes through some of the anomalies of the biblical text, because if something's not adding up for him at first glance, then it bothers him, just the way it bothers us. In fact, what are our after-class discussions about typically? Things within the text that bother us because we don't understand them completely. We don't understand why it's this way and not that way. Or we look for what's left out of the story. How do we get from here to here? Why do there seem to be two accounts of this that are kind of the same but not really? So whatever's bothering Rashi is probably what's bothering us too. The difference is he was a great Hebrew scholar, plus he had possession of the Jewish traditions concerning certain things. So he is a good reference source, along with Onkelos and some others. Sometimes going even back to the Midrash. The Midrash is, you're not expected to believe that it's 100% true, but it's helping to elucidate a point or to illustrate a point. So sometimes you'll see like Bereshit Rabbah. I think we're going to quote from Bereshit Rabbah today. We'll see that it was a tradition that was handed down, and nobody can date that tradition because we weren't around when it started. We don't know how many generations it's gone through. We don't know if it's gone through changes in the generation. But sometimes, because it does deal with the Hebrew text, which most of us don't read with the greatest of skill, it can bring out some things in the text that should bother us if we knew enough Hebrew for it to bother us, if that makes sense. And I only had 2 semesters of biblical Hebrew. All the other Hebrew I've ever done is modern Hebrew. I can, help you order supper if we're in Jerusalem, but it doesn't mean that I can dissect all the anomalies of the Hebrew grammar in the biblical text, especially when it introduces things that really are a departure from the biblical grammar. Modern Hebrew is much easier to learn because the the verb forms are much less complex. In fact, what you'll find is if you're taking even simple Hebrew class, modern Hebrew class, the hardest Hebrew words to read or to understand are English words. There's irony there. I was having a conversation with my tutor in Israel on Sunday, and I was trying to read this modern Hebrew word, and she was saying, you know, what does that mean to you? And I'm puzzling and I'm puzzling and I'm puzzling and I'm puzzling over it because it doesn't make any sense. It's out of a news article. And I said, I don't know what George Washington is. It had been transliterated into Hebrew, George Washington, but because I thought I was reading Hebrew, my brain did not connect that I was actually reading an English name that had been transliterated into Hebrew. And she got a kick out of that. Like, you don't know who George Washington is? I'm like, well, yeah. Oh, that's George Washington. Okay, now I understand. So those sorts of mistakes are pretty common, and that might account for sometimes there's different ideas about what some sort of anomaly in the text actually means. So we'll go through some of these. And I'm going to try once again to screen share with you, which is hard to do on my end. Because if something goes wrong, like if the sound starts dropping or if I start freezing up on you, it's hard for me to know that because I can't really see what you're doing. But let's try screen share here. And can you see that okay? Okay. Let me try this. How about now? Everything good? Okay. Lekh Lekha. Did somebody say something?
I did. I said it looks good. It's full screen PowerPoint.
Okay, good. I don't know how long I'll be able to read it because it puts things over the text where I can't see it, but we're going to try here. So let's go. This isn't really the beginning of the story of Abraham and Sarah. Had we had time in the Torah portion, Noah, as we got toward the end of Noah, we would have seen truly the beginning of the story of Abraham and Sarah, because what we didn't really discuss was the Tower of Babel. We didn't really get into much about the genealogy. I threw some things up there on the genealogy because I did want you to make the connection between the genealogies of the three divisions of mankind to the garden, where you're actually seeing names like Cush, like Havilah, and so forth, and you're seeing them pop up in strange places in the genealogies. Is there something to that? I'm willing to bet there is. We just don't have time to chase that down right now. And then also a descendant of Shem named Eber, or it might say Eber in your English Bible. But that has the root of Avar. And we did talk about Avar last week, how Adonai made a wind to Avar over the turbulent waters, and that means to pass over or to cross over. And so descended from Eber, as we go through the genealogy there at the end of Noah, we can see that Abraham, or Avram, as he's named at first, is going to be descended from Eber, and that might be one reason that he was called a Hebrew or an Ivri, one who has crossed, or one who is crossing. We don't have to say past tense. We tend to say that because it's kind of come into our vocabulary as one who's crossed over, but it can also mean one who is crossing over. It could actually take on a present tense reality of someone who is crossing from one realm to the next. And we know from last year's Torah portions that, especially when we start talking about Abraham and Sarah, we begin to have a resurrection conversation. And we'll see a little bit of how that works in this week's Torah portion. But there at the end of Noah, there is, and let's see what chapter is that? Chapter 11, verse 29. It says, and Avram and Nahor took themselves wives. The name of Avram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. Now, this is not something I really want to chase down because some rabbis have done some great jobs investigating that passage. And I want to say it's Rabbi Foreman, possibly, that did a study on Iscah and concluded that it's entirely possible that Sarai and Iscah are the same person, and that Avram actually took Iscah in a levirate marriage when his brother passed away, and she came to be known as Sarai. But that's an interesting study, but we're a little bit past that now. So we're going to go on, and we're going to look at Abraham and Sarah as a unit. And these are pictures from their tombs at Hebron. And that's another point I want to bring out in this week's Torah portion is everywhere you're seeing Abraham build an altar, at some point in your studies, it's good to take notes, especially if you're taking your note cards. I don't know how many of you are actually doing your note cards, but remember, as you're going through the Torah portions each week, it's good to have a big note card where you're recording all the important things that you want to remember about that particular Torah portion, because later you can reference them. And we use that technique a lot when we got over to the book of Revelation and we're starting to try to figure out what are these supernatural bugs here. And then it took us back to the Torah, and we had a reference for that. So it's the same concept here. When we're talking about Abraham and Sarah, now we're starting on some topics that will deal directly with them. And even though the language seems kind of obscure to us, it's in the planting of the altars, it's in the cutting of the covenant between the pieces, and even hidden in some of the language concerning the tents in the Torah portion, that we will begin to understand that Abraham and Sarah really were one in the biblical sense of the word. They were in a sense of unity most of the time. And when they were in unity, great things happened. But they truly are our father and mother in faith. And we'll look at a scripture that reminds us of that. So when you go to Hebron, to a town called Kiryat Arba, and you go to the cave of Machpelah, you're going to the burial place of Abraham, and the picture of the gate that's going down toward the tomb where Abraham is buried. And then over on the right is the one for Sarah, where it says Sarah Imenu, our mother, and Abraham Avinu, our father. Why is that important? Because in the Gospels, Yeshua stresses that there's an important identity attached to being children of Abraham, and not just being his physical descendants. Yeshua is very clear about that. Don't brag about being a physical descendant of Abraham and Sarah. What you need to be concerned about is doing the works of Abraham and Sarah. And so Lekh Lekha is one of the prime Torah portions that we can go to, and we can learn not only what it means to be a child of Abraham and Sarah, but how to do the works of Abraham and Sarah, because these are patterns of faith. And like it says in Hebrews 11, these are the people we're supposed to look to as examples of our faith. So if you ever have a chance to go to Hebron and visit the graves there, there's Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. And there is something special about that place. And those of you who have been in the class a year or two know what that special thing is. We'll eventually get to it here. So to start the Torah portion, basically we can boil down what Abraham is about to do into three things: go, grow, and bestow. It says, now the Lord said to Avram, go forth from your country. Okay, now I'm having trouble reading. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. That's the first thing. You have to go. Number 2, he says, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. All right, what is he saying will happen? There will be a growth. If you will go, you will grow. And then the third thing, he says, and so you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this is a step beyond what we've really seen up to this point in biblical history, which at this point is still pretty short, but this is the pattern we want to look at. If Abraham and Sarah are our father and mother, we have a physical father and mother, but we also have a spiritual father and mother, and that's Abraham and Sarah. Isaiah tells us that. So what do mom and dad have to teach us from the beginning of this portion? What does it mean to go for yourself? That's important. First of all, you do have to go. It requires a step where you have to leave that which is known to you. Your relatives, your father's house, where you grew up. Sometimes, in our case, maybe even the doctrines and the theologies and the cultural baggage that we grew up with, that we have had to go for ourselves and find out for ourselves who our relatives were. To accept that, yes, God gives us physical relatives, but he also gives us spiritual relatives. And the process of bonding to our spiritual relatives and to our spiritual father's house sometimes can have an adverse effect on our physical relatives and our physical father's house because of the perception. If they don't understand what we understand, and they don't see what we see, and they don't hear what we hear, that will cause some difficulties because we are passing from one side to another side. But he says, if you will go, then you will grow. What happens there? In that process, you are going to grow spiritually. And when that happens, that's what increases your name. That's what increases your reputation of righteousness. So we don't go because we want to be great, but we do go because we do want to grow. Because when we grow, when our reputation for righteousness increases, then also the reputation of the one whom we serve increases. For instance, let's say you drive to Chick-fil-A and you just have flawless service. These kids go above and beyond anything you would ever expect from a drive-through. They're pleasant, They don't cop attitudes with you. If something's wrong, they make it right and they double it for your trouble. Well, it doesn't matter that it's just good service so much as it reflects the people they work for. Because all by ourselves, we tend not to be that service oriented. But if you have a great supervisor, and that supervisor has a great supervisor, and that supervisor has a great boss, then eventually it's affecting on the ownership of the organization. So when we have, I don't want to say a Chick-fil-A heart in us, but when we are service oriented, then it does increase our reputation for righteousness. When our reputation for righteousness increases, so does the reputation of the Holy One. And he pretty much tells Israel that. When he gives them the Torah, he says these other nations are going to look at you and say, wow, what other God is so wise as the God of Israel, who has given them all these wonderful commandments to keep? Although I'm not really getting that reaction right now, one day across the world, the mitzvot, the commandments, will be recognized for the life that they bring into our lives and the great reputation of righteousness that comes with them. And then once you start building in that area, you start building your reputation, that's when you realize you're becoming a blessing to someone else. And that's sort of the spiritual mechanism that's put into place. As you go, as you grow, you begin to bless other people, but you can also become a curse to them, right? How many times does Abraham and Isaac and Jacob get asked to leave, or they leave in the middle of the night? Because if you're blessing them, you will be blessed. If you're cursing them, that curse is going to fall back down on you. But remember these three things, because it boils down really to this. It boils down to the fact that I can't advance the slide. There we go. Lekh Lekha, that's a double. It's more intensive than just go. Lekh means go. Lekha means to you. So it doesn't translate literally that great, but you can boil it down to go for yourself. Go for your personal benefit. And the point that's made here is that there's a couple of different ways we can go for ourselves. There are actions or moves that we can make that are beneficial, but they're not pleasurable. But there's also actions or moves that we can make that are pleasurable, but they're not beneficial, right? Like eating a bunch of candy. It's pleasurable if you have a sweet tooth, but it's not beneficial if you start losing teeth and get diabetes and all these other horrible things that can happen if you eat too much sugar. So sometimes when we do an action, it's either going to be one or it's going to be the other. But going to Israel, going to the land we are promised, is going to be both beneficial and pleasurable. It's not only going to be good for us like broccoli, but it's going to taste better. Unless you like broccoli, in which case, go ahead and be happy. But it's like getting your vegetables, but it tastes like dessert. So go for yourself, go for your personal benefit, not just for what's good for you, but what's going to bring you pleasure in life, what's going to bring you joy. He says, I will make your name great. And the rabbis take this not just as the reputation of Abraham, but they take it literally. In other words, I will enlarge your name. That's the way of looking at it. Not just that Abraham will be such a great name in the earth, but that I will literally take your name Avram and I'm going to make it bigger. I'm going to make it into Avraham. But I have to do that by adding a letter he. Now, where is he going to get this letter he? Some of you already know the answer. For those of you who don't, who are kind of new to this is how it works. We have Avram and we have Sarai. They're not yet Abraham and Sarah. So what has to happen is Sarai has to lose a letter of her name. She has to lose the yod, which is the little comma-looking letter. And it has a value of 10. It's the 10th letter of the alphabet. And what happens is you take that yod and you split it in two. Since its value is 10, now you divide it into equal parts, which is a Hebrew letter he, which has a value of 5, plus another Hebrew letter he with the value of 5. You put the he plus the he, that equals a yod. 5 plus 5 equals 10. So the yod, the 10, comes out of Sarai's name. It's split in two, and then it's divided between the two. Sarai now becomes Sarah, and Avram now becomes Avraham. So the he goes into his name. And if you think about it, it's kind of a type of a reverse creation story, where in Genesis 2, I believe, it's explained to us how Adam's side, that Eve, or the woman, was drawn out of his side so that the one became two, and they kind of split everything. The same thing is happening with Sarah and Abraham. It takes Sarah's yod in order for Abraham's name to increase. And that's kind of what it says in the book of Proverbs, that when a man obtains a wife, he obtains a good thing, and he obtains favor from the Lord. It implies that his prayers get through, that she's like a prayer booster for his prayers to go up to heaven. So you can see in Sarah's case why it enlarged Abraham. It made him literally, not just his reputation, but it literally made his name increase. So remember I said, remember these three things: go, grow, and bestow. Okay. Let's look at this. I don't want to really get into the ancient Near Eastern studies, because we've got lots of great people that are doing in-depth studies on A&E topics. But I do want to look at one, because I think it has to do with the Torah portion. In the ancient world, taking a long journey was considered a great risk. It was a big deal to make a pilgrimage. And it still is, but things are so much easier for us today. We have airports, and we have airplanes, and we have pilots, and we have buses, and we have air conditioning, and we have hotels, and we have hospitality services, and we have cabs. And so no, we don't have it that bad. But back then, it was a big investment to take a journey. And it was thought that there were three things that you risked when you took a journey. First, you risked your reproduction. It may be that you're going to be separated from your wife, so you're not going to reproduce. Or it was thought that if you were traveling even with your family, that the weariness of the journey would still affect your reproductive process. So it's not like going on vacation today and boom, you're pregnant. It was a much more stressful sort of thing to do. So it was understood that if you went on a journey, you risked reproduction. Second thing you were going to risk was money. If you've read a little bit of history, you'll remember, back in the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, how a lot of the big companies had to get a lot of finances together to finance the purchase of a ship to take a cargo to another country or halfway around the world, and a lot of them just shipwrecked. Insurance is a fairly new proposition. So there was great risk of bandits, foul weather. There were all sorts of things. Plus, you were going to have to pay customs. It's understood that one reason that Sarah was snagged by Pharaoh's men was they basically had to go through an ancient form of customs. I should have put a picture of the Roman customs house on here for you tonight, down at the Scorpion's Ascent. But that tells you how old the idea of taxing merchants is. They would set up where people traveled, and then you had to pay a tax. You had to pay a customs charge, and that was how they say that Sarah was brought into Pharaoh's harem, because they noticed her there. So you risked your money, losing it all or losing a lot of it. And the third thing was it diminished your name. And now that's something that we don't think about very much, because especially Americans, typically we don't stay where we were brought up anymore. I know when I was growing up, we moved every 2 to 3 years. So when people say, where are you from? I can probably name 3 places that I would be very comfortable calling home, maybe more. My real home, I think, is in Israel, because that's the only place it feels like home in spiritual realms. But in terms of just sliding in somewhere and say, well, we're home now, if I start to see those pine trees of Arkansas, then I start feeling that nostalgia. But in order to build a name, you have to stay put. People understood that in the ancient world. If you spend all your time journeying, running all over the world, going from place to place, then you don't have the time and you don't have the social resources to increase your name. And see, that was one of the promises to Abraham, is I will increase your name. I will make your reputation great. Well, in order for your reputation to increase, people have to know who you are. If you're constantly on the move, the people don't really know who you are. Neither the people where you left, nor the people along the journey. And so, as we look at the promises made there to Abraham, Lekh Lekha, it's not a light thing that Adonai is asking him to do. He's asking him to cross over his reservations that he might have in 3 main areas: the reproductive process, financial resources, and his reputation, building his family, building his name, which I think Abraham probably already had a pretty good reputation. And I think with Abraham, that act of faith, that's a good pattern for us. Because if he's our father and he's showing us what it will cost us to make a pilgrimage to Israel, because he was considered, like it says in Hebrews, he was still considered a pilgrim to Israel. Because they were looking, it says, for a better country. They arrived at the land, and it was a good land. But the good physical land was only a physical representation of a spiritual land that they had fallen from, the lower garden. And so going into the land of Israel, it's not just to go around and take pretty pictures of the Jordan and the rocks and the trees and go sit in the, garden and look down the Kidron Valley. Those are important things because they do help you to contemplate and reflect, but not just on the rock or the valley. It helps you to reflect upon the spiritual importance of that rock or that valley or that tree or that grave or that flower in the Galilee. Every one of those things, when you make a pilgrimage to the land, they take on a spiritual importance. If all you really see is the physical value of that spiritual vision, then what you're going to do is you're going to fall to the level of Lot. And we'll see that separation between Avram and Lot, how they're both going to raise their eyes. They're both going to see something spiritual in the land of Israel. But they're going to have two completely different relationships to that spiritual level of what they're seeing. Even so much, when Lot looks at the plain of the Jordan, he's able to even see it in the light of the garden, like the garden of God, it says. But how he relates to that spiritual vision is completely different than how Avram is going to relate to lifting his eyes. And that's one of the vocabulary phrases I think we've become accustomed to in Hebrew roots, where it says, lift your eyes or raise your eyes. We've come to understand that when we see that phrase, it means seeing prophetically. But there's also an understanding that not only are you seeing prophetically, it's entirely possible that you are looking back into the garden. There's some aspect of the lower garden that you're supposed to see that is teaching you about the resurrection. And that's why I say these altars that Abraham is building in the land as he makes his pilgrimage through there, they're distinctive in terms of what they represent to us, and helping us to acquire an understanding of Abraham and Sarah relative to the resurrection. And so if we get those lessons, then I think it's easier to get some of the language that Yeshua is using in the Gospels as it concerns the resurrection. So those are three things right there. They were ancient considerations, and I don't know that they've changed much in 3,000 or 4,000 years. If even today you talk to people about going to Israel, they're going to be very concerned that it will diminish their income, or they don't have the income to make the journey. And I've even heard this from a fairly well-known teacher talking about, would you be willing to move back to the land if that were possible? Would that be your goal, to move back to the land and live there? And he said, I've worked too hard building my reputation in the United States. Why would I go to Israel and be nobody? Now, I'm not going to tell you who said that. You might know who it was. But that was the mindset. And that was what I was thinking, is that kind of affects the first one and the last one. He was concerned about, but I spent so many years building my reputation here in the United States, and if I were to move to Israel, then it would diminish not just the money I could make, because it is hard to live in Israel, but the reproductive process. Because see, when you teach other people, they're considered like your children. And we discussed that as the wording of the relationship between Moses and Joshua, how the wording tells us that Moses considered Joshua one of his own children because he spent so much time discipling him. So if you go for yourself, you risk all three of these things, even in modern life. These are concerns. These are fears. I don't know that Abraham ever thought he would go back to Ur. I get the impression he understood that this would be bye-bye forever. And for us, if we just make a pilgrimage, let's say for a feast, we still worry about these things. We may not worry about the diminished reproduction, but it's definitely going to lighten up our bank accounts. And if you do have a name or a reputation, if you have to miss work, or you have to be away from your place of business, or you have to be away from your ministry for a while, if you're in the ministry, what are you going to worry about? You're going to worry about, I'm not going to be there in order to manage things, in order to make sure everything is still on a good footing. It's costing me a lot of money to do this. As far as diminished reproduction, well, I don't want to leave my new students out there searching the internet all by themselves. There's too much danger out there. And so what are we concerned about? That Adonai is taking all three of these things really out of our hands and just saying, if you will trust me and go, you're going to find out that it's beneficial to you in two ways. Not only will it benefit you spiritually, it will be good for you. You will enjoy it. And even you can see he's addressing this when he's giving the commandments to Israel to go up to Jerusalem. They're already in the land. And he's saying, but when you're in the land, I still want you to go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And just to kind of cut off these objections, he says, hey, look, if you go, I will make sure that your houses, whatever you leave behind, is protected. You have to trust me that I will take care of your reproductive process. I will take care of your money, and I will take care of your reputation. But it truly does demand of us to give up positions or feelings of power over our circumstances and to put it into the hands of Adonai to make this journey in order to get the Lekh and the Lekha, not just to go for what is good for us, what is an act of obedience for us, but what we will find in that act of obedience is that there is actually a joy and a pleasure in it that we didn't anticipate. It may be, which, I cannot stand Brussels sprouts, but if I were to ever stick a Brussels sprout in my mouth and find out that it tasted like a Butterfinger, wouldn't that be awesome? So maybe that's kind of the picture he's giving us. If you will trust me, if you will go, you might be dreading Brussels sprouts on the journey, but I'm going to make it like Butterfinger, Blizzard, or whatever you like. That may be a little extreme. Okay, so the blessings that he promises to Abraham, they specifically address these 3 alibis that an ancient person would have. He says, if you're worried about your reproductive process, don't, because I'm going to make you an heir, and you're going to father a great nation. And that promise actually increases once he gets into the land, because then he becomes a father of many nations. He says, don't worry about your financial resources. Because when he says the word blessing frequently, that means money or some sort of financial resources like cattle and servants and all that sort of stuff. And then the third one, he says, I will make your name great. In fact, it will be so great that other nations are going to respect it. In fact, I want to carry it one step farther than you would expect. You're not just going to be respected by those nations. If they bless you, I'll bless them. If they curse you, I'll curse them. That's a pretty big blessing. And that should have, that addressed all 3 of those ancient concerns, but nevertheless, it still took an act of faith for Abraham to pick everything up and to go. But now there's a change. Let's compare it to blessings that were on Adam or Noah. They both had blessings. For Noah, salvation, rescue was a great blessing. Adam had some blessings even after the fall. He had some blessings. But there's a difference when we see it, that blessing, when it goes into Abraham's hand. What we're to understand by that number 3 of the 3 blessings or the 3 concerns, he says, if you will go to the land in faith, and this is very specific, he says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So how would any family or nation in the earth be blessed from Genesis 12:3 onward? It's going to be by their relationship to Abraham and Sarah. Whether they're living or dead, it doesn't matter. Because remember, we're talking about a prophetic life, a walk of faith, a walk that teaches us the lessons of the garden. So the blessing, okay, if I'm going to bless you, the blessing is going to go from me to you, and it's over. We can see that with other people. Adonai gives them a blessing, it goes from them to the person, and then it's pretty much over with them or their immediate family. But something's different here. And I use this picture as an example. The picture on the left shows you what it's like to be the beneficiary of a blessing. Up to this point, you mostly see people who receive a blessing being the beneficiaries, being the sole beneficiary, or maybe immediate family being the beneficiary. But the promise made to Abraham extends it. And it actually makes Abraham a type of benefactor. Even though Adonai is still in charge of the blessing and apportions the blessing, now it's specifically related to how you relate to Abraham and Sarah, which is a greater picture. And that picture, by the way, is just a snapshot of them doing the Aaronic benediction at the Temple Mount. And you can see, how many different kinds of people are crowded in there for that blessing. It's not just Jews. It is the families of the earth that will crowd in there for that blessing, especially during the Feast of Sukkot. What does that tell us? To this day, people believe that blessing, that it's our relationship to Abraham and Sarah that determines either our blessing or our cursing, because they are our father and mother. How do you relate to your father and mother? Well, you're commanded to honor them, father and mother. In fact, it says it's the first commandment with a promise. What promise? So that your days will be long on the earth. Which earth? It might mean physical earth, but I think we have to see it as equally pointing to your spiritual life in the lower garden, that your days would be prolonged there. And we call that eternal life. Now that's quite a promise, but the resurrection, the first resurrection, is a promise of eternal life. How do we come to understand eternal life? Yeshua kept bringing up Abraham, that the best way for you to understand eternal life and the resurrection in the person of Yeshua is to go back to Moses and the prophets and try to understand the faith that Abraham and Sarah had. And that's, I think, really a turning point in the history of mankind. It's not just a blessing to receive on your own, but all of a sudden the blessing is based on how we relate to one another as children of Abraham, recognizing father and mother, Abraham and Sarah. Okay, let's see. This goes back to what we said about Abraham being descended from Eber or Eber. I could make a really bad pun there about Eber driving an Uber, but I'm not going to. We get the idea here that for Abraham to pass over or to cross over, he didn't do it just one time. Of course, he crosses the Euphrates to leave Ur. And the Euphrates, if you'll remember, is the farthest boundary of Israel. Even when the 12 tribes came into the land, they weren't given the land that far. So it tells you that there's another level. There's another plane of understanding. There's a physical level where it says, okay, here are the boundaries, and they're pretty small when you compare them to the later boundaries that are promised to Abraham, which is going to be the Euphrates and the Nile, the river of Egypt. That's huge. That's going to take in some new countries when that happens. But Abraham did first cross over the great river, the Euphrates, which, if you'll remember, the Euphrates is the Parat River of Eden. In the upper realm, that's what it was. In fact, Parat in English is Euphrates. So he passes over it. There's our word, if you can read the Hebrew, it's va'avur, Avram, and passed Avram into the land. And he went as far as Shechem to the oak of Moreh. And it says, now the Canaanite was then in the land. Now remember, Canaan is going to be a descendant of Ham. And somebody brought that up last week. What exactly happened in the tent? Well, we don't know exactly what happened in the tent, but we can guess. We'll look at some of the passages that have been put together to see if we can figure out what was going on with Canaan and Ham and Noah and possibly Noah's wife. There's hints there. But the passing, we would like to think, okay, we're Hebrews, we just have to make this decision and pass over. It's not like that. Abraham kept passing. That's about all he did. Most of his life was pass back and forth to different places. He goes from Ur, he crosses the great river, he's going to go down to Shechem, he's going to go down to Egypt, then he's going to pass back to Israel, he's going to move through the land. Different things are going to happen, and he's going to plant different altars. Like I said, we can look at some of these altars and maybe get an idea of what's going on there. But at any rate, that's where we get the idea of an Ivri or a Hebrew. It's one who passes. Okay, and here's where it gives the boundary. In Genesis 15:18, it says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Avram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Okay, hang on just a second. I'm going to stop the share. Get my handy dandy little menorah here. Okay, those boundaries we just looked at, they really don't match up with what we read later in the assignment of the tribes. Like I said, if we go from the Euphrates all the way to the Nile, we're talking a much greater physical area than what the tribes were given in the later assignment. But remember the four rivers of Eden. We've got this great river here, which Again, it's going to represent the river that flows from the throne. And this river here, this outer river, was the Pishon. Remember, it goes in a circle. So he's saying, basically, go back to the garden. If you want to understand this land, don't just look at the assignments of the tribes, even by Joshua. Go back to Genesis 2, go back to the Garden of Eden, and try to understand those rivers of Eden. And try to understand that if we talk about the Parat River, we're actually talking about a river that originates from beneath the throne of the upper garden. If we talk about the Pishon River, we got two possibilities. We've got the Pishon, where Adam was placed in the lower garden, but for whatever we're seeing in the lower garden, what we have to understand is it's mirroring something in the upper garden. So how do Abraham and Sarah get associated with the resurrection? It's part of this promise right here. He's saying, okay, I'm going to show you something, but what are Abraham and Sarah actually seeing? Are they just seeing trees and rocks in the physical land of Israel? Or did they actually go to the physical land of Israel so that they could lift their eyes and at least see as far as the lower garden? Now, remember, I think last week or week before, we talked about how possibly the two realms are separated by a membrane, as the way that Rashi described it, something as thin as a blade of grass. But when you lift your eyes, you're actually looking into the future, or you're looking past that membrane that blocks your vision of the spiritual realm. So he's telling Abraham and Sarah, I want you to look farther than the rocks and the trees. I want you to look all the way into the lower garden. I want you to look all the way back to Genesis 2. I want you to think about the rivers of Eden, because in the same Torah portion, it'll make a reference to the lower garden. He says, I want you to understand that your descendants, which is why we have to understand what it means to be a child of Abraham, your descendants will occupy that territory all the way to the upper garden. All the way from the lower garden to the upper garden. How do you resurrect? How do you ascend to the lower garden and then ascend to the upper garden unless you are a child of Abraham? Because it was only promised to his descendants. So physical descendants would confine you to a physical family, a physical line, a physical tribe in a specific place. But if we're talking about descendants who do the works of Abraham, who do the works of Sarah, they have become children. They have been brought into that family. They may not be linked physically, although ultimately we're all going to go back to one human being. They may not be able to physically trace their lineage to a certain tribe, but Yeshua is telling us it's by doing the works of Abraham and Sarah that you find a place for yourself. Lekh Lekha. That is how you go for yourself to find a place inside of these rivers. And so when you go to Israel today, you're driving around on the bus, you're picking up rocks, you're looking at trees, you're taking pictures of tax collector houses, from archaeological digs. It feels like you're in a very physical environment, but there is a part of you that knows it's not just what I'm seeing with my physical eyes, that there's something spiritual going on in this place, and my spirit knows it full well. If I could only look beyond the membrane. But here's the irony. You already did. Lekh Lekha. How did you get there? You risked reproduction. You risked your money, your financial resources, and you risked your reputation. Whatever it is that you had to walk away and risk things going wrong while you were gone. The risks are still the same today. You say, well, I haven't had a chance to go to Israel. All right, what else have you done for yourself? How else have you gone? You picked up the Torah and you started learning about your mother and your father. And you said, you know what? It's one of the 10 commandments. I have to honor my mother and my father. How am I going to honor my mother and my father? I'm going to do the things that they did and display the same faith that they displayed when they Lekh Lekha. And what you are finding, now that you are picking up the Torah, now that you're reading the prophets with new eyes, now that you're reading the Psalms with new eyes, now that you're reading the Gospels and the letters of the apostles with new eyes, what you realize is, hey, I've gone somewhere for myself. I have left where I was, and I have passed over to a different spiritual place. I am crossing over, and my life will be my life will be described as a series of crossings over. It may have started with just crossing from Sunday to Shabbat. It may have started with just crossing from Easter eggs to a Passover Seder. It may have started with just crossing from a Christmas tree to a sukkah. That's how it starts. And as you continue making your crossings, what you realize is sometimes I know I'm in Egypt. I definitely realize that, yeah, they're taxing me here. But there's a great little secret embedded. When you feel like you're in Egypt, it says, and Hashem afflicted Pharaoh along with his household with severe plagues because of the matter of Sarai, the wife of Avram. Pharaoh summoned Avram and said, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she is your wife? All right, remember the promise when they set out? I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. It may not feel like it. It may feel like you're losing. I mean, for Abraham, he had to sit there for a while knowing that his wife is sitting over in Pharaoh's harem. And this stage of our lives, it's kind of what it feels like. It feels like we are sitting in Egypt or we are sitting in Babylon and we're being held hostage. We're being separated from our heritage, from the rewards, from the promises of our faith. But in time, just like we read in Revelation, the plagues and the afflictions are coming to Pharaoh's house. The wording there, it says in English, Hashem afflicted Pharaoh along with his household with severe plagues because of the matter of Sarai. Well, where it says because of the matter of Sarai, in Hebrew it says Alvar Sarai. What does that mean? Well, literally, on the word of Sarah. What was going on? The rabbis say, well, wait a minute. On the word of Sarah? Well, remember what the promise was? Basically, Abraham, you're no longer just the beneficiary. Now you're going to be part of being the benefactor. Remember, was it last week that had the Torah portion that says every tongue that will rise up in judgment against you, you will condemn? Doesn't really say exactly when, he just says it's going to happen. Well, in this matter, we don't know exactly how long Sarai was in Pharaoh's house, but at some point, Sarai started speaking a word. And the plague broke out on Pharaoh's house. In fact, Rashi says, where it says, Devar Sarai, by her word, he says, she would say to the angel, Chak, strike, and he would strike, according to her word. So, faith, even when it feels like things are impossible, when it feels like we're bound up in the custody of the king of the abyss, when it feels like we're crossing and we're crossing and we're crossing and we're getting nowhere, we just seem to be going down farther into Egypt than we were before. We have to look back at the pattern of Abraham and Sarah and realize it was a series of crossings over. And each step of the way, he is being faithful to those three promises. That he did take care of their financial situation. In fact, it says when Avram left Egypt, it says he was heavy with livestock, silver, and gold. Heavy. So it probably felt like, one step forward and two steps back. And I think that's the way it's supposed to feel, because that's what increases our faith. But he's going to take care of us. And, the thing to remember is we're no longer just the beneficiary, that we need to intercede for people. What does it say? I forget which verse it is in Proverbs where it says, it's basically saying it's a good thing to pass over a transgression. Same root word, avar. What does a Hebrew do? Sometimes they pass over a transgression. Pasha. It's like something evil. And the idea there is when we can intercede for evil, what are we doing? We're recognizing that everybody is made in the image of Elohim. And just because he has called us to cross over doesn't mean that he gladly put into our hand the ability to curse people who offended us. Because the other side, and I'll talk with the other class tomorrow about the altars. One of those places of the altars is Mount Ebal and Gerizim, blessing and cursing. But he says, I want you to choose life. I think that has to do with the interactions that Abraham has with the people in the land and even outside of the land. It's not his first choice to curse. His first choice is to bless. Because that's a powerful thing that Adonai has put into the hand of Abraham. And if we are his children, that's a powerful thing that he's put into our hands. that we could actually speak words, like it says here, by her word, by Sarah's word. What happened? Severe plagues came on the house of Pharaoh. We need to intercede if we can. And make those continual crossings is what I call them. We just keep crossing over, because if you look at these rivers, if you're going to live within the rivers, what are you going to have to keep going? Keep crossing, because that's a lot of rivers right there. And rivers move. So we need to get better and better in the crossing, and get better and better at taking the blessing he has put into our hand, not just making us beneficiaries, but making us part of the process where he can benefit the families of the earth. He can also make us a point of their cursing. But that's, I believe, what it means to be a child of Abraham, is to have that consciousness of I'm a partner now with Adonai. I'm not just going to pray every day and ask for all the blessings in the world. That I'm going to pray every day, not just that I would receive the blessings, but that I would bestow them. So that I would go, that I would grow, and that I would bestow. That's how that journey started for Abraham.